Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. We say these 6 words all the time. Blessed are you, eternal, our God, ruler of the universe. And those words are so frequently followed by another familiar phrase anytime we are performing a commandment. Asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, who has sanctified us with commandments and commanded us to fill in the blank. A few years ago, I had a bar mitzvah student who was certain that the words were actually Asher kichanu bar mitzvotav. And even after explaining it to him, he insisted that I was wrong. He said those words every Shabbat, and he just knew that he was right. And I admired his confidence. His explanation was oddly comforting to me. We say those words, hopefully the correct ones, so frequently that they are ingrained in our minds. They become as fixed to ourselves as they are to our liturgy. But when was the last time you stopped to really wonder, what does that really mean? Especially that middle phrase. What does it mean that God has sanctified us with commandments? The Sfat Emet, a Hasidic sage to whom I frequently turn for hot takes that are radically unlike my own, offers an explanation. Only by means of the commandments can Israel do all their deeds in holiness, he explains. By performing a commandment, a person draws life into the world, into all things. More specifically, he says, it's a way of experiencing God's will in our bodies. By devoting all of the life force in that limb to the performance of a commandment alone, you can bring new life from the commandment into that limb, he says. And this is the meaning of, in his words, Asher kichanu b'mitzvotav. When we say these words before lighting Shabbat candles, for instance, we're able to channel holiness into our bodies as we light those candles. And by doing the thing, by making something physical happen while reciting these words that connect us to our ancestors, we actually create holiness. The hands lighting the candles, the space illumined by their light, the imagined memories of a Shabbos table spanning the millennia. All these things become sacred for a moment. I like this idea largely because I like ritual. Even those of us who struggle to believe in a supernatural deity or a creator of the universe can get behind the idea that there is meaning in ritual passed down over the generations. Ritual expresses something outwardly that we might have a hard time expressing about ourselves. Jewish ritual likewise expresses something outwardly that we have inherited, but may not always understand. I often talk about ritual and define it as a conscious expression of the self. And so by performing a ritual and making the blessing Asher kichanu b'mitzvotav, we're saying that there is something holy within ourselves, something innate to who we are that we must bring out into the physical world, even if we can't fully explain it. This is the subject of what's known to scholars as the Holiness Code, chapters 17 through 16 of Leviticus, where we find this week's parsha. This section of Torah is distinct from the rest of Leviticus in a number of ways. Commandments seem jam-packed against one another, and the word kadosh, or holy, appears as a frequent motif. There's a problem here. This holiness code, delineating many of the ways in which we can sanctify ourselves by God's commandments, includes some of the commandments that are most troublesome for us. Leviticus 18, which is the marquee chapter of this parsha, Acharei, is devoted to a sexual ethic that doesn't really work for us as modern Jews. As Judith Plaskow writes, this parsha evaluates sexual behaviors not in terms of the emotional and relational dimensions of sexual experience that are so central to judgments about sexuality today, but in terms of the categories of purity and pollution. Here, we find an absence of women as agents of their own lives and a reification of the patriarchy. And it is here, as well, that we find the famous prohibition against homosexuality. We might be forgiven if we just said, well, we can ignore that part. And in our Reform approach to sacred texts, that's frequently where we land. Others might look historically or sociologically at the text and say, Israelites did this in their time for X, Y, and Z reasons, but those reasons no longer apply in our time. And that's fine too. But at the beginning of the text depiction of a sexual ethic that is not an acceptable one for many of us, there's a preamble that may solve our problem and may teach something more important even about performing any of the mitzvot. In Leviticus 18:5 we read, Ushmartem et chukotai et mishpatai. You shall keep my laws and my rules. Asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam b'chai behem, by the pursuit of which human beings shall live. Ani Adonai, I am the Eternal. You shall keep these laws v'chai behem, and live in them. One Reform reading, therefore, could be, for those laws expressed here, with which we cannot live our most sacred lives, the Torah is actually giving us a pass. The mitzvot, as we know, are meant to be performed. Therefore, if we cannot perform them for any reason, be it our commitment to modern values, or our sexual orientation, or any other indelible trait, specific commandments sometimes lose their force. Much of the time, we're able to follow the Torah's laws as a way of enacting sacredness, becoming holy by our behaviors. Sometimes, we're not able or prepared to do so. Ramban, the evil Spanish sage, says this clearly about the language of this verse. He explains, know that the life one gains through observing the commandments matches the preparedness or orientation one has toward them. He points to other examples of chai, life, in Torah, to conclude that all the different kinds of life appropriate to each person individually are thus included in the Torah. Commandments are equal for all Jews, but each individual Jew will have a different orientation toward them. For those whose orientation or preparedness exclude them from living by these commandments, Ramban's words offer here a pastoral invitation to decide for ourselves which mitzvot cannot be followed. We cannot live our truest selves. We cannot create relationships worthy of God's blessing, or feel liberated in our selfhood by certain mitzvot. Those commandments actually might no longer apply. Because sacred living is what Torah asks of us, especially in this week's parsha. And every time we say Asher Kishanu Mitzvotav, we are reminding ourselves to sanctify our lives by commandments. We must do what's available to us among the teachings of Torah and do those mitzvot the most authentically we can if we are to live a life of holiness. Now, importantly, this reading is not just a workaround to avoid those commandments that confound us most. It's an imperative to do our best always to direct our lives toward holiness. Returning to the Sfat Emet, he translates this verse from our parsha to mean, you should put most of your life force into Torah and commandments. Your ikar hachayot, the root of your life, shall be directed toward Torah. In other words, we can direct all parts of our being, even those subconscious parts that we don't understand, into performing mitzvot, because it's in this way that we become holy. My hope is that everyone in this room, or everyone who wants to, feels comfortable saying the Hebrew words, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, and pronouncing them more or less correctly. But my greater hope is that when we say the words Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav, We'll leave room for the possibility of sacredness. We'll find mitzvot through which we can be exactly who we are. And through those mitzvot, we might live. Shabbat shalom.